Imagine an entire people living under the shadow of fear. The Philippines, since 1942, had been dominated by the Japanese Empire. Enemy soldiers patrolled the streets, the sound of their boots echoed on the asphalt, and entire families survived amid hunger, torture, and summary executions. Any sign of rebellion was crushed mercilessly. Filipino pride was wounded, but never extinguished. In the midst of this nightmare, there was a promise made by a tall man wearing sunglasses and smoking a pipe, General Douglas MacArthur. When forced to abandon the Philippines after the fall of Corregidor, he swore before the people, "I shall return. I will return." These words echoed like a sacred oath, keeping alive the hope of millions who awaited his release. Now, in October 1944, that promise was becoming reality. The largest invasion fleet ever assembled in the Pacific was sailing toward Leyte Island. The sky trembled with the roar of the engines of hundreds of battleships, transports and aircraft carriers. The sea seemed covered in steel. Massive battleships, some survivors of Pearl Harbor, sailed alongside aircraft carriers bristling with fighters and bombers. On the deck of one of the ships, MacArthur surveyed the horizon. He wasn't just a general in that moment. He was the symbol of a promise fulfilled. Every soldier knew that this landing would not be just another military operation, but the beginning of the liberation of an entire people. And then, on the day, October 20th, 1944, all hell broke loose. The sky erupted in flames. American planes rained bombs down on the Japanese defenses, and battleships launched earth-shaking salvos. Each shot made the beaches of Leyte tremble as if a volcano had awakened. The landing craft advanced. The sea was tinged with foam and smoke, and the soldiers, soaked and nervous, awaited the imminent impact of combat. When the boat ramps opened, they rushed to the beaches amid the whistling of enemy bullets and the roar of mortars. The sand was mixed with blood, and screams echoed everywhere. And then, amid the chaos, MacArthur stepped ashore, not as a fugitive, but as the liberator he had promised to be. His presence was a jolt of hope. For the Filipinos, it was like seeing a myth come true. The general didn't just return. He returned with fire, with steel, with a relentless fury to sweep away the invaders. Thus began the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, and the moment when MacArthur's promise reignited the fires of resistance in the Philippines. Don't miss the next epic World War II story. Subscribe now and dive into the fires of battle. The Japanese plan, Operation Shogo. As MacArthur and his fleet advanced to fulfill the promise of liberation, across the Pacific in Tokyo, the Japanese generals knew the fate of their empire hung in the balance. If they lost the Philippines, they would also lose access to Southeast Asian oil. Without fuel, their giant ships and planes would be nothing more than floating scrap. It was then that the Operation Shogo, a desperate, almost suicidal plan to turn the tide of war. The idea was simple on paper, but brutal in execution. Divide the Japanese fleet into 3 forces, each with a deadly purpose. A central force, commanded by Admiral Takeo Kurita, would have the heavyweight, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Its mission was to cross the Philippine Sea and furiously attack the American troop transports at Leyte. Southern Force would try to advance through the Surigao Strait, crushing anyone who dared to block its path. And in the north, a carrier force, virtually devoid of aircraft, would serve as bait. The intention was clear: to lure the American fleet, led by the impetuous Admiral William Halsey, away from Leyte, paving the way for Kurita to massacre the invasion transports. The plan was a last gasp for the Imperial Navy, but there was one cruel detail. The Japanese knew they were throwing men to their deaths. Many ships didn't have enough fuel to return. It was all or nothing. It was war to the last ship, to the last drop of blood. When the Japanese fleet's engines roared, shattering the stillness of the night, every sailor knew they were embarking on a journey of no return. Some prayed, others sharpened their bayonets, but all were aware that they were sailing toward a sea that would become a graveyard. Thus, the board was set. On one side, the greatest naval force the world had ever seen, commanded by the Americans. On the other, the Japanese Navy, in its final bid to save a doomed empire. And when these two tides met, Leyte Gulf would become the scene of the greatest naval battle in human history. Every battle has a price, and every story deserves to be remembered. Subscribe and follow every detail. The landing on Leyte. The day October 20th, 1944 dawn broke, shrouded in smoke and thunder of steel. The sea off Leyte Island resembled a volcano about to erupt. American ships fired, incessant salvos, blasting craters into the beaches, while planes dove from the sky, dropping bombs that sent up black columns of smoke and sand. The roar was so intense that the very ground seemed to tremble. On the landing craft, young men, some barely 18, others battle-scarred veterans, awaited the order to advance. Their sweaty hands gripped their rifles tightly, and their eyes stared at the wall of fire ahead. Each knew that when the ramp lowered, their lives could end in seconds. The entrenched Japanese were ready. Machine guns were positioned in concrete bunkers, artillery was hidden on hills, and snipers were hidden among palm trees and makeshift buildings. They knew they couldn't win at sea, so they decided to turn every inch of beach into a living hell. As the first boat ramps fell, the silence was shattered by screams and explosions. American soldiers ran across the sand as bullets sliced through the air like swarms of deadly bees. Some fell instantly, struck before. They could even take 3 steps. Others dove into bomb craters for cover. The sea behind them was dyed red. Japanese artillery responded furiously, shaking the beach. Flames consumed stricken amphibious vehicles, and bodies floated among the wreckage. Still, the tide of men continued to advance, sustained by discipline and the sheer will to survive. It was in this apocalyptic scenario that the General Douglas MacArthur, he disembarked, not in an ordinary boat, but almost theatrically, marching through the water alongside his men. The scene was recorded and spread around the world, the general fulfilling the promise he had made 2 years earlier. For the Filipinos watching from afar, it was like seeing hope descend from the heavens in the flesh. But MacArthur wasn't there to pose for the cameras. He knew this landing was just the beginning. The beach still smoked with blood and gunpowder, and the island's interior hid lethal traps set by the Japanese. Leyte would be a prolonged killing field. That day, however, the impossible happened. Despite the casualties, despite fierce resistance, the American and Philippine flags began to be raised again on soil that had been taken by the enemy. The promised return had become reality, and the liberation of the Philippines had just begun. If you want to feel the roar of cannons and the drama of war, subscribe and don't miss any episode. As American soldiers took up positions on the beaches of Leyte in the heart of the East China Sea, a colossal force was moving in. It was the Japanese Central Force, the backbone of Operation Shogo. In the middle of it sailed a steel monster that seemed to have come out of a nightmare. The Yamato, the largest battleship ever built in the history of mankind. The Yamato was the pride of the Japanese Empire, a floating fortress. Its armored hull seemed impenetrable, and its main guns were so gigantic that each shot was equivalent to an earthquake. The Japanese saw it as the embodiment of their hope, the last card of a cornered empire. Beside it followed the Musashi, its equally imposing twin brother, both accompanied by heavy cruisers and destroyers that cut through the waves like hungry predators. But the grandeur hid a bitter truth. The fleet lacked fuel for a long campaign. Many knew that once they left, they might never return. Even so, Admiral Takeo Kurita didn't hesitate. It was victory or death. Inside the ships, the mood was one of resignation. Sailors wrote farewell letters. Some kept small family amulets, while pilots sharpened their bayonets. knowing that soon the sea would become a graveyard. The roar of engines echoed through the metal corridors, each beat like the rhythm of a foretold funeral. The Yamato and Musashi advanced like titans toward Leyte Gulf. But on the other side, the Americans were already waiting. Aircraft carriers packed with fighters and bombers circled the skies, ready to launch devastating strikes. The world's greatest naval battle was about to pit the cannon tradition against the airplane era. And when the sun rose over the Sibuyan Sea, the gigantic shadows of the Yamato and Musashi were first seen by American pilots. From above, they didn't just see ships, they saw steel monsters that needed to be brought down at any cost. Thus began the march towards the duel that would seal the fate of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Courage, blood, and strategy await you. Click subscribe and experience history with us. The air battle in the Sibuyan Sea. The day October 24th, 1944 dawned heavy, with the sky heavy with clouds. But for the American pilots, neither weather nor distance mattered. The order was simple: find and destroy the Japanese fleet. Early in the morning, reconnaissance planes spotted Kurita's force, and there they were, the steel beasts, the Yamato and the Musashi, sailing like floating mountains, surrounded by cruisers and destroyers that protected them with iron and fire. When the news reached the American aircraft carriers, the decks became a hive of activity. Crews scurried around carrying 500-kilogram bombs, fuel tanks were dragged, and pilots, eyes fixed and jaws clenched, scrambled into their cockpits. Within minutes, the skies were filled with hundreds of aircraft, buzzing like a swarm of deadly wasps towards the Sibuyan Sea. Explosions, strategy, and sacrifice await you. Click subscribe and experience every battle. The first attack fell like a thunderbolt upon the Musashi dive bombers, plummeted from the sky, dropping their payloads just meters from the enemy hull. Each impact shook the giant, columns of water and fire rising dozens of meters. The noise was deafening, as if the entire sea were being ripped apart. The Musashi resisted, with each bomb that exploded above it. It seemed to rise more furiously. The Japanese sailors fought bravely, running from one side to the other, putting out fires, plugging holes, loading ammunition. The anti-aircraft defenses spat fire in all directions, transforming the sky into a spectacle of red tracers and explosions. Several American planes were shot down, plunging into the sea in flames. But the attacks did not stop. The Musashi became the primary target. Torpedoes struck its sides, cracking the hull. Water began to flood the lower compartments. The monster rocked but still kept moving forward. Pilot after pilot dropped bombs until the steel beast, already dozens of times impacted, began to slowly list. Late in the afternoon, the inevitable happened. The Musashi, the pride of Japan, was swallowed by the sea. The immense battleship broke apart in flames, taking with it thousands of sailors. Some managed to jump, but most were sucked into the waters of the Sibuyan, along with their ship. The Yamato, even wounded, managed to escape, but the message was clear: the era of cannon-toting giants was coming to an end. Small, light and fast planes had destroyed what had once seemed indestructible. And yet, Admiral Kurita did not give up. Even after the loss of the Musashi, he kept his fleet heading toward Leyte. The bloodshed that day only heightened the tension for the confrontation that was yet to come. World War II history like you've never seen it before. Sign up and witness every epic moment. Kurita's advance. Even after the sinking of the Musashi, the Admiral Takeo Kurita did not retreat. His fleet, though scarred by losses and running low on fuel, advanced determinedly through the Leyte Strait. Every ship still moving carried Japan's desperate hope to destroy the American transports and crush the invasion before Leyte was firmly in MacArthur's hands. The sea ahead was shrouded in a haze of smoke and hot steam, the aftermath of explosions that had struck Japanese and American ships. The waves reflected the grey sky, and the distant roar of guns echoed like a harbinger of chaos. On every deck, sailors exchanged silent glances. They knew they were sailing toward a near-impossible confrontation, but honor and duty drove them onward. Meanwhile, the Americans, still reorganizing after the Leyte landings, watched the Japanese giants approach on the horizon. Cruisers, destroyers, and escort carriers prepared to face what could be the Imperial Navy's last and most lethal threat. The atmosphere was tense. Every radar, every lookout, every commander knew that the next hour would decide the fate of hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. Kurita knew his time was short. Every kilometer traveled consumed fuel that could not be replenished. He had to strike quickly before Halsey or any American reinforcements could intercept. And so the ships advanced, crossing the Sibuyan Sea with almost suicidal determination. The first battles began with torpedoes fired from Japanese destroyers attempting to sink American escort vessels. The firefight was brutal. Each explosion sent up columns of water and shrapnel, turning the sea into a bloody battlefield. Still, Kurita maintained his formation, aware that any disruption could spell disaster. Kurita's advance was not just a military maneuver. It was a march fraught with tension, bloodshed, and heroism. Men fell at every turn, but the fleet continued on its course, as if fate itself were being challenged in the steel of the ships. The coming battle promised to be even bloodier and more decisive than any previous engagement in that campaign. Heroes have fallen, empires have trembled. Are you going to miss this story? Subscribe now. The attack on Surigao Strait, revenge. Of the old battleships, the Battle of Surigao Strait, fought in the dark and treacherous waters off the Philippines in the early hours of October 25, 1944, was not just a naval engagement. It was an epic of strategy, resilience, and, for the U.S. Navy, a moment of redemption. While the Japanese Center Fleet, under Admiral Takeo Kurita, advanced toward the San Bernardino Strait, another crucial part of the ambitious Operation Shogo unfolded to the south in the Surigao Strait. There, the Japanese Southern Force, led by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, was tasked with breaking through the Allied lines and attacking the American invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf. However, what Nishimura encountered was not a clear passage, but a meticulously prepared trap. A stage where the old American battleships, many of them survivors of the infamous attack on Pearl Harbor, would have their revenge. The night of October 25, 1944, was almost impenetrably dark, the sea calm but tense, like the pent-up breath of a predator. The Japanese fleet, consisting of the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers, advanced in column formation, confident in its night-fighting capabilities, an area in which the Imperial Japanese Navy had excelled. Nishimura, a veteran of many battles, was aware of the risks, but underestimated the magnitude of the force that awaited him. He believed the main threat would come from aircraft carriers, and that under the cover of night he could avoid detection and accomplish his mission. On the American side, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commander of the 7th Fleet, had orchestrated a layered defense, a masterpiece of naval tactics. He positioned his forces in a way that turned the strait into a death row. The first line of defense consisted of 39 PT torpedo boats, divided into sections of 3, patrolling the dark waters. Their mission was to harass the Japanese fleet, inflict initial damage, and, crucially, report the enemy's position and speed. Further ahead, a line of destroyers stood ready to launch their own torpedoes, followed by a line of cruisers, and finally, the backbone of the defense, the battle line of 6 battleships positioned to intersect the T of the Japanese formation. This was the classic maneuver of naval warfare, allowing the American ships to fire all their main batteries at the Japanese ships, which could only respond with their bow guns. The first contact occurred shortly after 10:30 p.m., when the PT boats sighted Nishimura's force. The small, agile boats launched their torpedoes, but most missed or were repelled by the defensive fire of the Japanese ships. Nevertheless, the attack served its primary purpose. The Japanese fleet was now exposed, its position and course revealed. Oldendorf and his commanders now knew exactly where and when to strike. The next phase of the ambush began around 3 a.m. The American destroyers, divided into 2 squadrons, advanced at high speed and launched a massive wave of torpedoes. This time, the results were devastating. The battleship Fuso was hit by multiple torpedoes and, in a cataclysmic explosion, broke in 2, sinking within minutes. The destroyers Yamagumo, Michishio, and Asagumo were also hit and either sank or were severely damaged. Despite the terrible losses, Nishimura, aboard the Yamashiro, pressed on, determined to fight to the end. It was then that he walked into the final trap. Oldendorf's cruisers and battleships, which had remained silent until then, opened fire simultaneously. The night sky was lit up by a deluge of 14 and 16-inch shells, which rained down on the remaining Japanese formation with apocalyptic fury. The Yamashiro was hit repeatedly, its guns silenced, its superstructures transformed into a mass of twisted, burning metal. The cruiser Mogami, also badly damaged, attempted to retreat, but was relentlessly pursued and later sunk. What followed was a massacre. The Japanese ships, outnumbered and outgunned, were systematically destroyed. Surigao Strait became a graveyard of steel and fire, the sea stained with the oil and blood of the ships and men who perished that night. The Battle of Surigao Strait was the last major naval battle in history to be fought between battleships, and it marked the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. For the aging American battleships, it was a bitter and triumphant revenge, proof that even in the age of aircraft carriers, the raw firepower of big guns still had a role to play in the history of naval warfare. The first kamikaze attack, the terror of the skies, and the changing face of naval warfare. As the waters of Leyte Gulf and Surigao Strait teemed with the brutal clash between the American and Japanese fleets, a new and dark chapter in naval warfare was about to be written. Amid Japan's desperate attempt to reverse the course of the war in the Pacific, a tactic emerged that defied Western military logic and struck unprecedented terror into the hearts of Allied sailors: the kamikaze attack. It was not just a new weapon, but an extreme manifestation of sacrifice and fanaticism in which pilots transformed their own planes into guided projectiles, deliberately intending to ram enemy ships, ensuring mutual destruction. This strategy, born of Japan's growing disadvantage and an unshakable belief in duty to emperor and nation, would forever change the face of maritime combat. The term kamikaze, meaning divine wind, refers to 2 typhoons that saved Japan from Mongol invasions in the 13th century. This mystical connotation was skillfully exploited by imperial propaganda to inspire pilots to become modern-day divine winds, protecting Japan from an imminent invasion. The idea of suicide attacks was not entirely new to Japanese military culture, but their systematic and organized application on a large scale as a formal tactic was a direct response to the Allies' overwhelming material and numerical superiority, especially after the catastrophic losses of experienced pilots and aircraft. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, with its monumental scale and increasing pressure on Japanese forces, became the ideal breeding ground for the deployment of this extreme tactic. It was on the morning of October 25, 1944, at the height of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that the world witnessed the first officially organized and successful kamikaze attack. The American fleet, exhausted by intense fighting and still reorganizing after the Japanese onslaught, was caught off guard by this new and terrifying threat. From the grey, overcast sky, Japanese planes appeared, not in conventional combat formations, but in near vertical dives, with a suicidal determination that defied any logic of survival. Each of these planes, often adapted Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighters, carried a bomb that, on impact, could tear a ship to shreds. The deafening roar of the engines at full throttle and the whistling of the wind around the wings created a deadly symphony, a harbinger of destruction capable of freezing the blood of any sailor who dared look up. The target of the first attack was the escort carrier USS St. Lo, CVE-63, part of Task Unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, operating off Samar Island. The Special Attack Unit, named Shikishima, composed of 5 Zero fighters led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki, was responsible for this inaugural attack. At 10:47, one of the planes, piloted by Seki, dove toward the USS St. Lo. The impact was devastating. The plane struck the ship's flight deck, penetrating the structure and detonating its bomb. The USS St. Lo exploded in a gigantic column of fire, a hellish sight that shocked observers. Shrapnel and debris spewed everywhere, hitting the water and nearby ships. The carrier's deck quickly turned into an inferno of uncontrollable flames, fueled by jet fuel and ammunition. Sailors were thrown from the ship, some burning alive, others swallowed by the raging ocean waters. The pungent smell of gunpowder, burning oil, and charred flesh permeated the air, making the scene almost unbearable for those trying to rescue survivors or fight the fire. The American reaction, though swift, was often ineffective against the suicidal determination of the kamikaze pilots. Machine guns and anti-aircraft guns opened incessant fire, creating a barrage of lead and explosions in the sky, in a desperate attempt to bring down the attackers before they reached their targets. However, the sacrifice of these pilots was absolute. Many continued their death dive even after suffering severe damage, their aircraft in flames or missing pieces, displaying a fanatical determination that shocked any Western observer. The idea of an enemy willingly sacrificing itself to inflict maximum damage was something new and deeply disturbing to the Allied military mindset. Kamikaze attacks transformed naval warfare into something unpredictable and excruciatingly personal. No matter how strong the ship, how thick its armor, or how experienced the sailors, in a matter of seconds, a suicide plane could wreak deadly havoc, bypassing conventional defenses. Each kamikaze explosion added to the chaos, dyeing the sea red with the blood of the wounded, and spreading fire across the decks and interior compartments of the ships. The mere sight of a diving Japanese plane became a trigger for panic and adrenaline, a constant threat looming over the fleet. Despite the horror and brutality of these attacks, American sailors continued to fight with bravery and resilience. Each ship struck was a cruel reminder of the price of victory, but also a testament to human courage in the face of near-certain death. The kamikaze not only destroyed ships, but also undermined confidence that war could be predicted or controlled by conventional tactics and technology. It introduced an element of irrationality and fanaticism that was difficult to combat, and even more difficult to comprehend. Leyte Gulf had become the stage for a new era of combat, a terrifying blend of heroism, sacrifice, and terror that no one could ignore. The sky, once a space of freedom and aerial maneuver, was now a constant threat, a constant reminder that a period of respite could be the last. The kamikaze tactic, although it failed to reverse the outcome of the war, left an indelible mark on military history, symbolizing the desperate and brutal Japanese resistance in the final stages of World War II. The historical context and genesis of the kamikaze. To understand the rise of the kamikaze tactic, it is crucial to delve into the context of World War II in the Pacific in 1944. After years of overwhelming victories at the beginning of the conflict, Japan found itself in an increasingly precarious position. The industrial and resource superiority of the United States and its allies was becoming insurmountable. The campaigns in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and, more recently, the Marianas had decimated Japanese naval aviation and drastically reduced its aircraft carrier fleet. The The loss of experienced pilots was particularly devastating, as training new aviators was a lengthy and complex process, and Japan simply could not replace its losses as quickly as the Allies. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, known to the Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was a near-fatal blow to Japanese naval aviation, which lost hundreds of aircraft and pilots in a single day. This grim reality led Japanese strategists to seek desperate solutions to contain the Allies' relentless advance toward the Japanese home islands. It was in this desperate and urgent context that the idea of suicide attacks began to gain traction. Japanese military doctrine, deeply rooted in Bushido, the samurai code of conduct, valued personal sacrifice and honorable death in battle above all else. Dying for one's emperor and nation was seen as the pinnacle of loyalty and bravery. Although individual suicide attacks had already occurred sporadically, the formalization and organization of units dedicated to this tactic was an innovation of Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines. Onishi, aware of the shortage of aircraft and qualified pilots and the pressing need to deter the Allied invasion of Leyte, proposed the creation of special attack units in which pilots would deliberately crash their explosive-laden planes into enemy ships. He believed that this tactic, although extreme, would be the only way to inflict significant damage on the American fleet and buy time for Japan to reorganize. The formation of special attack units and the baptism of fire. The first Kamikaze unit, officially known as Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, Divine Wind Special Attack Unit, was formed on October 19, 1944, based in Mabalacat, Philippines. Initially, the unit consisted of 24 volunteer pilots, most of them young and inexperienced, but imbued with patriotic fervor and unwavering determination. Training was minimal, focusing only on takeoff and basic navigation, as landing was not a concern. The aircraft used were primarily Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, which were light, agile, and could easily be adapted to carry a 250 kg bomb. The simplicity of the tactic, fly toward the target and crash, allowed pilots with little combat experience to be quickly trained and deployed. The Kamikaze's baptism of fire occurred on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The American fleet, composed of aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, was engaged in intense combat with Japanese naval forces. Task Unit 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3, composed of 6 escort carriers and 7 escort destroyers, was operating off Samar Island, providing air support for the troops ashore. It was against this formation that the Kamikazes launched their attack. Lieutenant Yukio Seki, a talented young pilot, was chosen to lead the first mission. Although initially reluctant to sacrifice his life, Seki accepted the mission with a sense of duty, expressing to a journalist that he would die, not for the emperor, but to protect his family and his country from invasion. At 10:47, Seki's squadron sighted Taffy 3. In a steep and relentless dive, Seki directed his Zero directly at the escort carrier USS St. Lo, CVE-63. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire, the plane struck the St. Lo's flight deck, penetrating the structure and detonating its bomb. The explosion was catastrophic, triggering a series of fires and secondary explosions that quickly consumed the ship. The USS St. Lo sank in less than 30 minutes, taking with her 143 of her crew. This was the first major warship to be sunk by a kamikaze attack, and the event sent shockwaves throughout the American fleet. Other ships of Taffy 3 were also attacked, with the USS White Plains, USS Kitkan Bay, and USS Kalinin Bay suffering significant damage, though they were not sunk. The USS Gambia Bay, another escort carrier, was sunk by Japanese surface fire in the same battle, but the psychological impact of the kamikaze was much greater. The psychological impact and consequences of kamikaze tactics. The initial success of the kamikaze attacks, though limited in strategic terms, had a profound psychological impact on the Allied forces. The idea of an enemy unafraid of death and willing to sacrifice itself to achieve its objective was something Western militaries were unprepared to face. The kamikaze tactic transformed naval warfare into a deadly lottery, where luck and reaction speed were as important as armor and firepower. With each Japanese plane that appeared on the horizon, the tension on the decks of American ships increased exponentially. Anti-aircraft defense, however intense, was often insufficient to deter a pilot determined to crash. American sailors, accustomed to facing an enemy intent on survival, now found themselves facing a threat that defied the very logic of war. Although kamikazes caused considerable damage and sank dozens of Allied ships throughout the war, they failed to reverse the course of the conflict. The Allied numerical and material superiority was overwhelming, and losses, though painful, were quickly replaced. However, kamikaze tactics forced the Allies to develop new defensive strategies, such as increasing the number of radar picket patrol vessels, improving anti-aircraft tactics, and using combat air patrol cap fighters to intercept kamikazes before they reached the ships. The Battle of Okinawa in 1945 was the height of the kamikaze attacks, with hundreds of Japanese pilots sacrificing themselves in a desperate attempt to halt the invasion of the island. Despite heroic efforts and the high cost in lives and ships to the Allies, Okinawa was conquered, and Japan was further isolated. The legacy of the kamikaze is complex and controversial. For the Japanese, kamikaze pilots are seen as heroes who sacrifice themselves for the nation, a symbol of loyalty and bravery. For the West, they represent the fanaticism and brutality of war. However, it is undeniable that the kamikaze tactic marked a turning point in the history of naval warfare, introducing an element of psychological terror and an unprecedented challenge to conventional defensive tactics. The divine wind failed to save Japan from defeat, but it left an indelible mark on the memory of World War II, a grim reminder of the human cost and desperate resilience in times of extreme conflict. The philosophy behind sacrifice, Bushido, and the Japanese spirit. To understand the kamikaze pilots' willingness to sacrifice their lives, it is crucial to examine the profound influence of Bushido, the way of the warrior, on Japanese culture. This code of conduct, dating back to the medieval samurai, emphasized unquestioning loyalty to one's lord, in this case, the emperor and the nation, honor above life, courage in the face of death, and moral rectitude. Death in battle, especially in an act of supreme sacrifice, was seen not as a tragedy, but as the glorious culmination of a life dedicated to duty. For many young Japanese of the time, raised in an educational system that instilled these values from childhood, the opportunity to become a kamikaze was the highest form of service and a guarantee of honor for their families and ancestors. Beyond Bushido, state propaganda played a key role in shaping the pilots' mindset. Japan was portrayed as a divine nation, protected by gods and destined to lead Asia. The Allied invasion was presented as an existential threat to Japan's very essence, and individual sacrifice was glorified as the only way to repel this threat. Patriotic songs, poems, and impassioned speeches celebrated the warrior gods who flew to their deaths, transforming them into martyrs and national heroes. Social pressure and the expectation that every citizen do their part in defending the homeland were immense, and refusal to volunteer for the kamikaze units was viewed with disdain and dishonor. The legacy and lessons of the kamikaze. Although the kamikaze tactic did not alter the outcome of World War II, its psychological impact and the lessons learned from it are undeniable. For the Allies, suicide attacks represented an unprecedented challenge, forcing them to rethink their defensive strategies and deal with an enemy operating outside Western military conventions. The resilience and courage of Allied sailors who continued to fight and defend their ships even in the face of such a terrifying threat are a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of extreme adversity. For Japan, the kamikaze is a complex symbol. On the one hand, it represents the pinnacle of sacrifice and loyalty, a reminder of a nation's determination to defend its sovereignty. On the other, it is a grim reminder of the hopelessness and fanaticism that can arise in times of total war. The tactic, while inflicting significant losses on the Allies, also resulted in the deaths of thousands of young Japanese pilots, many of whom had barely completed their training. The memory of these sacrifices continues to be a topic of debate and reflection in modern Japan. In a broader sense, the kamikaze phenomenon serves as a case study in the psychology of war, the power of ideology, and the devastating consequences of extreme conflict. It reminds us that in desperate times, nations can resort to tactics that defy comprehension, and that the human cost of war goes far beyond the statistics of ships sunk and aircraft shot down. The divine wind of World War II, though it ceased to blow in 1945, continues to echo through history as a grim reminder of the human capacity for sacrifice and destruction, the escalation of attacks, and the Allied response. After initial success, the kamikaze tactic was quickly expanded and integrated into Japanese strategy, especially as the war approached the home islands. The number of kamikaze units grew, and pilots of all ages and experience levels were trained for these sacrificial missions. Attacks became more frequent and coordinated, targeting not only aircraft carriers, but also battleships, cruisers and destroyers, in the hope of crippling the Allied invasion fleet. The Battle of Okinawa in 1945 became the stage for the largest and most intense kamikaze campaign, with over 1,900 suicide missions launched against the Allied fleet. During this battle, kamikazes sank 34 ships and damaged another 368, causing over 5,000 American sailor casualties. The Allied response to the kamikaze attacks was multifaceted and evolved over time. Initially, surprise and shock were the primary factors, but Allied commanders quickly began developing countermeasures. Combat air patrols, CAPE, were increased to intercept kamikaze planes before they reached the ships. Anti-aircraft artillery was improved, with the introduction of new weapons and tactics, such as the proximity barrage, which detonated shells close to targets, creating a cloud of shrapnel. Furthermore, evasive maneuver tactics were developed, involving ships making sharp turns and changing speed to avoid collisions. The creation of advanced radar pickets, composed of destroyers and other smaller ships, operating tens of kilometers from the main fleet, allowed for early detection of kamikazes and gave the fleet more time to prepare for the attack. However, even with all the countermeasures, the kamikaze threat remained a constant source of anxiety and stress for Allied sailors. The unpredictable nature and fanaticism of the attacks meant that no ship was completely safe. The sound of a diving plane, even from a distance, was enough to cause panic and drive crews to their battle stations. Many sailors developed what has been called combat fatigue, a form of post-traumatic stress disorder caused by the constant threat of imminent death. The courage and resilience demonstrated by these men, who continued to operate and fight under such conditions, is a remarkable testament to the human capacity to endure terror. The lasting legacy and historical analysis. The kamikaze, as a phenomenon, transcended World War II and became a universally recognized term describing any act of extreme sacrifice in the name of a cause. However, the historical analysis of the kamikaze is complex and multifaceted. For some, it represents the barbarity of war and blind fanaticism. For others, it is a symbol of the desperate resistance of a cornered nation, which resorted to extreme measures to defend its existence. It is important to note that not all kamikaze pilots were enthusiastic volunteers. Many were pressured into joining the units, and the line between volunteerism and coercion was often blurred. The average age of the pilots was only 20, and many were university students who had been drafted into military service. The strategic impact of the kamikazes was limited, although they caused significant losses and delayed the Allied advance on occasion. They failed to change the course of the war. The United States' industrial and resource superiority was so overwhelming that kamikaze losses were quickly replaced. However, the psychological impact was immense, forcing the Allies to expend considerable resources on anti-aircraft defenses and evasive tactics. The kamikaze tactic also influenced post-war military thinking, leading to a greater focus on carrier defense and the ability to intercept air threats at long range. Today, kamikaze attacks are a grim reminder of the brutality of war and the extreme measures nations can take in desperate times. They serve as a case study in the psychology of sacrifice, the influence of culture and ideology on the conduct of war, and the human cost of conflict. The memory of the kamikaze pilots and the Allied sailors who faced them remains a painful but instructive chapter in the history of World War II, a testament to the complexity and tragedy inherent in all armed conflicts. In Isca, I am deceived by Capengano. As all hell broke loose in Leyte and Surigao, the northern part of the archipelago became the scene of another desperate move by the Imperial Japanese Navy. A fleet of aircraft carriers, virtually devoid of aircraft, advanced in Cape Engano, serving as bait to attract the American fleet, led by Admiral William Halsey. The idea was cruel and ingenious. Halsey, known for his aggressiveness, would spot the Japanese aircraft carriers and believe they were about to launch a devastating attack. The expectation was that he would divert his fleet north, leaving Leyte Gulf vulnerable to the advance of Kurita's force. It was a trap of pure strategic calculation, human lives as chess pieces. When Halsey received the reports, there was no doubt. He advanced with his aircraft carriers, cruisers, and destroyers, like a lion stalking its prey. The northward movement left Leyte temporarily, without the protection of its main naval force, but Halsey was confident in his skill and the firepower he commanded. Meanwhile, on the decks of the Japanese aircraft carriers at Cape Engano, officers and sailors knew their chances of survival were slim. Without enough planes to actually attack, they were living targets, sailing toward their destination with courage mixed with desperation. Every torpedo fired at them or bullet fired by the Americans could be the last sound they would hear. As the first American planes appeared on the horizon, the Japanese began firing their anti-aircraft guns, trying to shoot down the attackers before they caused destruction. But the difference in strength was overwhelming. One by one, the Japanese ships began to sink, exploding in columns of fire and smoke. Sailors jumped overboard, some swallowed by the waves, others burning alive as the ocean became a graveyard of steel and fire. Despite the loss, the bait worked. Halsey moved north, opening the way for Kurita in Leyte Gulf to have a chance to attack the American transport. The Japanese plan was risky, bloody, almost suicidal, but it demonstrated the extreme determination of an empire willing to sacrifice everything to try to turn the tide of the war. The stage was set. Leyte still burned with fire and blood, and the next engagement would decide the fate of the Imperial Japanese Navy and the entire Philippine campaign. The impending disaster in Samar and the morning of October 25, 1944, as Kurita advanced through Leyte Gulf, a group of smaller American ships, known as Taffy 3, came across the Japanese fleet. They were only small escort aircraft carriers and destroyers, a brutal contrast to Kurita's steel giants, battleships, heavy cruisers, and thousands of tons of floating destruction. The shock was instantaneous and terrifying. For the American sailors, it seemed like an impossible nightmare, looking at the horizon and seeing steel monsters bearing down on them, knowing that any mistake would be fatal. The power difference was overwhelming, almost suicidal, but they had enough courage to attempt the impossible. The first impact was devastating. Torpedoes and massive shells ripped through the small ships, sending up columns of water and flames that stained the sea red. The shots pierced the water and air with deadly whistles, striking decks, machinery, and crew. Sailors fell, others rushed to put out fires or rescue wounded comrades, while the ocean seemed to devour them. Even with the chaos, the Taffy 3 did not retreat. Destroyers advanced boldly, launching torpedoes at cruisers and battleships that outnumbered them in size and power. Each attack was a mortal risk. Many American ships were hit or sunk quickly, but each action also caused unexpected damage to the Japanese fleet. Escort pilots dropped bombs and fired machine guns, supporting the defense with everything they could. The battle became a deadly ballet of fire, explosions, and human courage. The roar of Japanese cannons echoed like thunder, while small vessels moved like ants amid giants, each maneuver potentially saving or condemning lives. And then, something unexpected happened. The courage and determination of the small American ships confounded Kurita. He believed he was walking into a larger trap, and the pressure of the battle combined with the fear of losing his entire fleet caused the admiral to retreat. The impossible happened. The little ones defeated, in a way, the giants. Imminent. Disaster for the Americans was averted, but the price was high. Destroyers and aircraft carriers were destroyed, and sailors sacrificed their lives in an act of extreme heroism. Samar became the stage for one of the most courageous actions of all naval warfare, demonstrating that determination and strategy could overcome brute force, at least for a moment. The desperate resistance of the destroyers. At the heart of the impending disaster in production, American destroyers, small, fragile, and outnumbered and outgunned, became the ultimate symbol of courage. Ships like the USS Johnston, the USS Hull, and the USS Samuel B. Roberts. They advanced boldly against Japanese cruisers and battleships, launching themselves like human arrows toward steel monsters. Each torpedo launched was a life-or-death gamble. Enemy guns fired with a deafening cadence, tearing chunks from the deck and throwing men overboard. Explosions sent up columns of water and flames, while the roar of splitting metal rent the air. The smell of gunpowder, burning oil, and burning flesh filled every space on deck. Even under repeated hits, the destroyers continued to advance. Sailors shouted orders above the chaos, some trying to save wounded comrades, others racing to fire the last remaining torpedoes. Every maneuver was improvised, every decision made under the pressure of absolute fear. The psychological impact on the Japanese was also evident. They hadn't expected such determination from such small vessels. The coordinated attacks, even if suicidal, created confusion in the enemy formation. Admiral Kurita began to realize that the American fleet might be preparing a larger trap. The USS Johnston, hit by several shells, still advanced to launch its torpedoes, sinking enemy cruisers. The USS Hull, surrounded by 5 Japanese ships, continued firing even after suffering catastrophic damage. Each ship that fell was a brutal reminder of the price of courage. Sailors disappeared beneath the waves, their exploits becoming instant legends. This desperate resistance not only saved the American transports from certain massacre, but also changed the course of the battle. The destroyers' firepower and extreme heroism confused Kurita, who, at a critical moment, decided to retreat. The impossible had happened. Lesser men and ships overcame giants through sheer bravery and sacrifice. Samar thus became an icon of naval courage, a place where history would record that, even surrounded by hell, human determination could resist steel and fire. The heroism that turns the tide. No final to October 25, 1944, after hours of absolute chaos in Samar, something extraordinary happened. The heroism of the small American ships began to turn the tide of battle. Every destroyer, Every destroyer and every escort carrier, even when hit or in flames, fought on with a determination that bordered on the impossible. The sailors were exhausted, covered in oil, blood and soot, but their courage surpassed their fatigue. Every torpedo launched, every cannon salute fired, every risky maneuver to protect the transports was a declaration. They would not be crushed. USS Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed the ship that fought like 10, attacked much larger Japanese cruisers, creating confusion and causing the enemy to hesitate. Kurita, observing the unexpected resistance, began to realize that success would not be easy. Every explosion, every torpedo that struck his ships, fueled the fear that he was falling into an even deeper trap. It was a stark contrast. Steel giants sank before smaller but bolder and more determined ships. The confusion and the incessant American attack forced Kurita to make an impossible decision: retreat. The Japanese invasion force, which had seemed unstoppable hours before, began to withdraw, leaving behind the sea dyed red with the blood of Japanese and American sailors. The heroism that turned the tide in Samar was not just a tactical victory, it was a moral victory. He proved that courage, sacrifice, and strategy could overcome any seemingly insurmountable obstacle. Ordinary men became legends that morning, and their actions would echo for decades as an example of extreme bravery in the face of almost certain death. Leyte Gulf thus became a symbol. The tide of war in the Pacific was turning. The Japanese Empire, despite its power and tradition, was beginning to feel the weight of defeat, while MacArthur's promise continued to be fulfilled, battle after battle. The end of the Japanese Navy. After the intense clashes in Leyte, Surigao and Samar, the Imperial Japanese Navy was irreversibly weakened. The fleet that once dominated the Pacific seas was now a shadow of its former self. Legendary battleships like the Musashi had been sunk, dozens of cruisers and destroyers were lost or badly damaged, and the experienced pilots who were the lifeblood of Japanese naval power had fallen victim to enemy fire or their own desperation. Leyte Gulf had become a steel cemetery, with sunken and burning ships still floating in the murky waters. The air was thick with the smell of burning oil, gunpowder and blood. The sight was devastating. Pieces of deck, shipwreckage, and bodies floating in the sea, reminding everyone of the colossal toll of that battle. Out of fuel, with reduced forces and shattered morale, the Japanese Navy had no capacity to conduct significant offensive operations again. The remaining commanders knew that any attempt to attack again would be suicidal, and that their fleet, which for decades had symbolized power and prestige, was now doomed to the defensive or to complete destruction. For the Americans, the victory was both overwhelming and strategic. With control of Leyte Gulf, invasion transports could advance more safely, allowing ground troops to consolidate the liberation of the Philippines. MacArthur and his commanders now had a relatively clear path to recapture the archipelago, thus fulfilling the promise that had so inspired the Filipino people: "I will return." The end of the Japanese Navy was not just the loss of ships and men, but also the collapse of a naval tradition that had once dominated the oceans. The war in the Pacific was changing forever, and Leyte was the milestone of this transformation. A bloody, cruel, and decisive victory that sealed the fate of most of the Imperial Japanese fleet. MacArthur keeps his promise. With naval victory assured and the Japanese Navy severely weakened, attention turned to the liberation of the Philippines. Leyte became the starting point for the campaign that would fulfill the promise made by Douglas MacArthur in 1942. "I shall return." MacArthur landed on Philippine soil with an air of solemnity, but also of urgency. The general didn't just walk among his soldiers. He embodied the hope of an entire people. The streets and villages were scarred by the Japanese occupation. Destroyed buildings, abandoned bodies, families who had suffered years of fear and hunger But MacArthur's arrival brought not only troops, but the promise of justice and freedom. As they advanced through the island's interior, American forces encountered fierce Japanese resistance, but now without the cover of a powerful fleet. Every town and village became the scene of bloody fighting, with Filipino soldiers joining the Americans, fighting side by side. Explosions, gunfire, and the roar of heavy weapons created a chaotic, almost apocalyptic, yet determined scene. MacArthur's presence had an almost symbolic effect. American soldiers and Filipino warriors felt they were fighting not just for territory, but for the fulfilled promise of liberation. Each advance on the ground signified that the oath of 2 years ago was finally being fulfilled, and the Japanese occupation was beginning to crumble. The Filipino people, watching the general walk among their liberators, felt a mixture of relief, hope, and excitement. Leyte was just the beginning, but this moment represented resurrection of a nation under the fire of war, and MacArthur's promise had been fulfilled with courage, strategy, and sacrifice. The blood spilled, the broken steel, and the fire at sea were not in vain. Leyte became the landmark of a historic liberation, and MacArthur's presence cemented the symbolism of a return that forever changed the course of World War II in the Pacific. The price of victory. The victory in Leyte, although historic, had a terrifying cost. The Gulf, now American-held, still bore the remnants of a bloody and brutal battle. Sunken ships floated in the murky waters, scattering wreckage, bodies, and the unmistakable smell of gunpowder and burnt blood. Each victory was etched with the price of thousands of lives lost, both Japanese and American. American and Filipino troops advanced through the interior of the island, liberating towns and villages, but the scene they encountered was devastating. Homes destroyed, civilians wounded or killed, and fields scarred by explosions and fires. The war was not just a battle of ships or planes, but a visceral experience of pain, courage, and human sacrifice. American soldiers carried the wounded, comforted the survivors, and at the same time prepared to face the last remnants of Japanese resistance. Each step forward demanded greater sacrifice, but also symbolized the fulfillment of MacArthur's promise. The blood spilled on the beaches, in the seas, and in the streets of Leyte became the price of freedom, which until then had been merely an oath. For Japan, defeat meant not only the loss of a large portion of its fleet and thousands of soldiers, but also the moral and strategic collapse of an empire that was in inevitable decline. For the Americans and Filipinos, each victory came with the reminder that war takes its toll, even on the most glorious victories. In the end, Leyte became a historical landmark, an epic, bloody, and decisive battle that demonstrated human courage in the face of death, the power of strategy, and the strength of a promise kept. MacArthur's return was not merely symbolic, it was one with blood, steel, and determination, reminding all that freedom often rises from the ashes of the deepest destruction. A Battle of Leyte wasn't just a sequence of fights, it was a testament of the human spirit in the face of chaos. Skies torn by explosions, seas stained with blood and broken steel, told the story of ordinary men transformed into heroes, of audacious strategies, and promises that defied time. MacArthur's return fulfilled more than a political promise. Here surrected the hope of an entire nation, showed that courage, sacrifice, and determination could turn the tide of history. Every torpedo fired, every battleship sunk, every kamikaze pilot who went down in flames left an indelible mark on the memory of the Pacific. Leyte was the turning point that defined the fate of the war in the Pacific, sealing the decline of Japanese naval power and paving the way for the liberation of the Philippines. But victory did not come without a cost. Thousands of lives were sacrificed, each a reminder of the price of freedom. In the end, what remains is not just the wreckage of the ships or the flames that consume the horizon, but the legend of men and women who fought until their last breath, turning blood and iron into history. Leyte was not just a battle. It was proof that human heroism can emerge even from the darkest depths of war. The memory of that day echoes to this day, reminding us that amidst chaos and destruction, courage and a promise kept can change the course of the world.